My name is Chris Curran. I'm an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Florida's College of Education. For the last several years, my colleagues and I have been studying the use of law enforcement in schools, often called school resource officers or SROs, through a project funded by the National Institute of Justice. This project seeks to understand the type of impacts that SROs have and the way they're implemented, particularly in the elementary school setting, and understand the ways that law enforcement impact a variety of outcomes from school safety to discipline to the day-to-day interactions of students in the school environment. Over the last several years, there's been a lot of research emerging on the impacts of school resource officers in schools. A lot of the research on SROs has been focused on whether the SRO is present in the school or not. So essentially this means that there are studies comparing schools that have an SRO with schools that don't have an SRO, and then looking at outcomes related to safety, related to school discipline, and so forth. Unfortunately, a lot of this research finds that SROs tend to have negative impacts when they're present in a school. They may increase the likelihood that a student is suspended from school. They may increase the likelihood that a student encounters an arrest or other involvement with the criminal justice system. In our research, we wanted to dig more deeply at what happens inside a school when an SRO is present. So obviously within a school you have hundreds of students and you have an SRO. That SRO interacts with students on a regular basis, but not with all students to the same amount. In other words, there's variation between students who may interact with the SRO on a daily basis to other students who may say that they infrequently or almost never interact with the SRO. And so it's important from a research perspective to understand what those impacts are when an SRO is interacting with a student more frequently versus less frequently. So a big emphasis of this research project in this particular study was examining how interactions with SROs and the frequency of those interactions relate to different outcomes of student disciplinary infractions as well as students' feelings of safety in school. So we found when we look at survey data across about 25 schools that students who interact more frequently with SROs are no more or less likely than students that interact with them less frequently to experience a disciplinary consequence. This finding was a bit of a surprise given existing literature that suggests that SROs can have an impact in increasing disciplinary consequences for students. It may be that in our research this outcome with regard to discipline is a particular artifact of the context and setting we were working in. Our school districts were in general higher functioning, higher performing districts that served a wealthier and generally more white student body. And so when we talked to students on the ground in focus groups and interviews, we found that when we asked students about SROs' involvement in discipline, the students almost universally said that SROs were not involved. So in other words, they didn't see SROs as being part of the disciplinary structure or handing out especially official disciplinary consequences like a suspension. In addition to looking at disciplinary outcomes, we also looked at safety outcomes. One of the primary motivators for having school resource officers in schools is that they are meant to increase students' feelings of safety. And so through our surveys and various statistical analyses, we were able to compare students who interacted quite frequently with SROs with students who interacted less frequently with SROs. And we asked them a series of questions about how safe they feel at school, whether they worry about threats to their safety at school, and whether they see the SRO in particular as increasing their safety in school. What's interesting is that when we look at students who interact more frequently with SROs, we find that they are no more or less likely to report feeling safe at school as compared to students that interact less frequently. However, they are more likely to say that they see the SRO, him or herself, as increasing their safety at school. So there's a bit of a disconnect. The SRO interactions don't make students feel more safe at school, but they do make students feel that the SRO is keeping them safer at school. To understand that, we were able to dig into some of our interviews and focus group data to see how students describe these interactions with SROs on the ground. What we found is that there's a bit of a nuanced interaction when students sit down and talk with SROs or interact with SROs on a regular basis. On the one hand, these interactions communicate a message to students that SROs are there for their safety. So SROs will commonly tell students that the reason they're in schools is to protect them from a threat, to make sure the students are safe. And so this may explain why more frequent interactions with an SRO makes a student see the SRO as increasing their safety in school. On the other hand, however, these kinds of conversations with the SRO perhaps have the possibility of raising a student's sense of risk at school. Now they're being reminded on a regular basis that there is some threat to their safety. They're perhaps now more likely to worry about an external intruder entering the school or an act of violence like a school shooting. And so when we talk to students, we'll see students say things like, well, many years ago, like when my parents were in school, there wasn't a need for a police officer. But now we have a need for the police officer. Or we'll see other students say, well, I worry about the police officer being in the school because he has a gun. But their worry is not necessarily about the police officer's gun, but the worry is about what would happen in the case of school violence if that police officer was not well trained enough with a gun or able to use that gun effectively to stop the incident of school violence. So it seems that students actually have a heightened sense of what the risks are that they face in school. This is a bit ironic and a bit unfortunate because despite the fact that we've seen a number of these high-profile school shootings in recent years, these incidents still remain extremely rare. So the likelihood of a student experiencing a school shooting or other act of mass violence in the school is highly unlikely. In fact, in most cases, schools are one of the most safe places for students. Students are safer in school than they are, in many cases, outside of the school environment. So our findings suggest sort of this nuanced relationship between interactions with SROs and feelings of safety. It's one in which SROs on the one hand may be seen as a safety-inducing mechanism, but on the other hand, through their conversations and messages, they may actually be sending an implicit message, or in some cases a more explicit message, about the types of threats that students face in the school. What our findings mean for SROs and educators on the ground is that we need to think about how we shape messages for students. An SRO may in some cases be an important component of ensuring school safety for students. However, there are ways in which SROs may restructure the types of conversations and messages they send to students that can make sure that the SROs aren't sending a message of threats and a message of potential risks to the students. So for example, when an SRO describes the reason that they're in a school to a student, rather than explaining it in terms of being there to protect the student from a potential threat or being there to ensure the student's safety, they might instead discuss it in terms of building relationships or bridging gaps or teaching the students about the functions and acts of law enforcement. We also think that when SROs are engaged in the activities of schools, particularly around things like active shooter drills and other safety drills, there are ways to make sure that those drills are not overly scary for students and developmentally appropriate. So for example, we've seen some anecdotal cases in recent years where some of the active shooter drills have been quite extreme, with the SROs or other law enforcement officers, and in some cases actually going through hallways with fake guns and threatening to shoot teachers, threatening to shoot students, and so forth. These are the kind of things that we think are entirely inappropriate for the SRO to be involved in the case of an active shooter drill. So we would encourage schools and SROs to think carefully about the messages they send, both explicitly and implicitly, to ensure that their types of actions in the schools are not heightening the sense of risk for students, particularly among some of the youngest educators, such as elementary school students. Our research then suggests that SROs and those districts that are implementing SROs should be careful about the types of messages that SROs are sending to students. Rather than an SRO perhaps communicating to students that they are there for the student's safety or to prevent some sort of tragic incident like a school shooting, SROs could instead focus on messages of relationship building or teaching students about the roles of law enforcement. These subtle shifts in how SROs describe their roles and their activities in the schools may go a long way for helping students not necessarily get a sense of heightened risk when they interact with an SRO.